Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. We have a return guest, friend of the pod, Civics bestie, Dr. Michael Butler. If you have not listened to the letter from a Birmingham jail, I think personally that is one of the most important primary sources in American history. Again, everybody has their opinion. That is a really big one. So we had done this. So Dr. Butler is back. And today we're going to talk about the I Have a Dream speech, which arguably is one of the most recognizable, one of the most famous speeches that Dr. King has given. So Dr. Butler, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Liz. It's always nice to be a friend of such a great pod. So thank you for the generous introduction.
So can you give us a little context of what's happening kind of around this speech before we really get into the speech itself?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you gave the letter from a Birmingham jail episode a shout out, because this is like the sequel, right? You can't really understand where the I Have a Dream speech is coming from unless you understand the context of 1963. And you're right. If it's almost like name association. Dr. King, I have a dream. Yep. The letter from Birmingham jail was the written defense of nonviolence that frames the movement into a uniquely American tradition. Remember that ultimately what comes from Birmingham in 1963 from that campaign is a push internationally for President John F. Kennedy to enact a Civil Rights Act. And on the same night in June of 1963 that he goes on television and promises this, one of the most significant figures in American history, Medgar Evers, was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. So there is the promise of a federal Civil Rights Act, a piece of legislation that would kill Jim Crow with a signature, right? Instead of fighting these battles on a case-by-case battle basis throughout the South, the promise is made, but there's a lot of significant political pressure being applied on JFK. Is this something that he's going to follow through on? He's made the promise, but Kennedy was not a big supporter of the movement or for civil rights. He saw bigger fish to fry, like the Cold War and everything that had happened in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So Kennedy is afraid, given the amount of pressure applied by Southern Democrats in particular, who are segregationists, that this act may be politically detrimental to the entire party, and 1964 is going to be a re-election year. So, in response, for the first and last time, the 5 largest civil rights organizations came together for a common cause and basically decided that we are going to have a celebration we are going to demonstrate that there is interracial, that there is an interfaith, there is intergendered support for a Civil Rights Act by having a March on Washington, where we demonstrate to the Democrats, to Kennedy, that you have more to gain politically than to lose by supporting this piece of significant legislation. So, it is in the age of social media, whether, today, the social media, these protests coming together in a 2-month period is not unheard of. But to bring the nation, to focus the nation's attention on Washington, D.C. in such a short amount of time, given the fact that there are disagreements and there are arguments within these organizations on who should speak, what should be prioritized, it's no small feat. They did not know And Liz, I think this is important for all of us who are interested in history, particularly those of us who teach history. We have to emphasize and remind our students constantly that the people involved in these events do not know how the stories will end. We do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot to lose. What if nobody shows up? What if there's no national attention? What if there's violence? Okay. So the day is planned. It's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August
Mm-hmm.
28th, 1963. The remarkable thing is that 250,000 people at least show up. And it was decided that there would be 10 speakers throughout the day, all male, by the way, which is interesting in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the capstone, the final speech, because he was the person that was the face of the Birmingham campaign, because the Birmingham campaign was the reason that President Kennedy went on record and promised a Civil Rights Act that the last speech of the day would be given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that kind of sets the context. That sets the stage for people who want to do a deep dive. Look into the person who is really the architect of the March on Washington, a man by the name of Bayard Rustin, right? Who has been in the shadows for a variety of reasons, both politically and personally, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of organizing this massive march. The legacy of A. Philip Randolph, who during World War II had planned a march on Washington to force the integration of the armed forces. He got the integration of the defense industry instead. So there are a lot of factors here. So when you mention context, there are a lot of moving parts here that go into what we typically only remember as the last part of a reality check, often a very stark, dire reality check that Dr. King gave the nation on that
Mm-hmm.
afternoon.
I'm so glad you brought up Bayard Rustin because, again, I think he gets lost to history for lots of different reasons, but he really is the architect of this. So, we've talked about Birmingham. President Kennedy sees this on TV, sees the fire hoses, sees the police dogs, and all of this comes together to this speech.
Yep.
And again, I feel like this is, if you say I have a dream, people know exactly what you're talking about. So Dr. King is standing in front or on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial giving this speech. Give us some, I'm trying to think of how to say this. Can you put us there? What was it like to listen to this speech from this man? Because again, Letter from a Birmingham Jail is written, right?
Yes.
This is spoken. So it's a very different, if you read this, it has, I think it has meaning and it has power, but listening to it every time I get goosebumps because it's so well done.
Liz, that's a great point. I think that one of the things that we forget is that for much of the nation, this is their introduction to hearing Dr. King speak. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And to set the context, let's not remember that Dr. King received numerous death threats.
Yes.
The situation was so dire that civil rights organizations had people stationed at trees to make sure there were not snipers perched in them. Right. So
Wow.
this is, yeah. The context here is important. The other part of context, to your point about the oratory magnificence of Dr. King, is that throughout his life, he always considered himself, first and foremost, a minister of the gospel. He was a Baptist preacher. And there is a certain style that comes with the African American church, particularly in the South. I mean, the church was the foundation of the entire movement from Montgomery
Mm-hmm.
all the way through Memphis. So, yeah, to your point, the rhetorical skill, the repetition, the use of scripture, the references to the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the books of Isaiah and Amos. He references Richard III. He references Shakespeare. He references The Lost Cause with Stone Mountain. He references the molehills of Mississippi and even My Country 'Tis of Thee. This is, for a variety of reasons, right, the most important speech of the 20th century, bar none.
Mm-hmm.
What we tend to remember, though, is the last section, the I Have a Dream section.
Yes.
This is where I think sometimes, as teachers and as scholars and as people who are interested in the historical wholeness of these moments, where sometimes we take our eye off the ball. The I Have a Dream part is redemptive. It is aspirational. It's often the snapshot of where people want to think of Dr. King. It's that moment where he's saying, I have a dream that my children will be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, right? That's what we hope. But that's not where we are in 1963, and it's not where we are in 2026. Oftentimes we freeze, in my opinion, that moment of Dr. King in the I Have a Dream proclamation as sort of Black Santa Claus, right?
Mm-hmm.
He is the best of us, and this is who we are. No, he's saying that we've got a lot of work to do to get to that point, right? So if you read the speech, if you listen to the speech, for me, it is another indication, it's sort of a Rorschach test for the nation, where he's holding up a vision of, do you want justice or do you want harmony? He mentions justice 4 times before he gets to the I Have a Dream section, right?
Mm-hmm.
We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. The whirlwinds of revolt will shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But we're not there yet. Remember the place. He's in front of the Lincoln Memorial.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's how it begins. And what he basically says to begin the I Have a Dream speech is that we are no closer to justice as Black Americans, and as Americans as a whole, by the way. We are not at a place of justice because of the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. We're not there because African Americans live on an island of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. He talks about police brutality and how Black people in Mississippi cannot vote, while Black people in New York have nothing that they believe to vote for, right? So it is a reality check 100 years later of what we were promised by our founders is no closer to fruition than it was then. So that's the reality check. It often shocks students that when I teach the I Have a Dream speech, that he's referencing police brutality, right? That he is referencing the fact that Black people in America were given a bad check, that it's a promissory note that 100 years later we have to cash today to guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans equally, right? So there is this reality check of where America is in 1963 and the promise of what America can be if it realizes its promises equally to all citizens. And that's where we get into the I Have a Dream part of the speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's often said, and it's true, that a lot of celebrities are there, Liz, right? Bob Dylan played before Dr. King spoke. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, on the Lincoln Memorial. He played only a pawn in their game, which was about the assassination of Medgar Evers, right? So, yeah, there are celebrities there. Marlon Brando's there. Mahalia Jackson, the famous gospel singer, is actually seated on the steps behind Dr. King. And she, because she had heard parts of this before, noticed that the crowd, he's losing the crowd. It's kind of a bleak picture of where we are. And she said, tell him about the dream, Martin. Now, whether or not he heard her say this is kind of up for debate, but he does launch into what I call Black Baptist preacher mode. That's where he goes, have a dream. And that was a rhetorical device that he had used in many speeches before. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time. As a matter of fact, in Detroit, just a few months earlier, he had given a version of this speech that was actually put out by Motown Records. Okay. So, yeah. Yeah. The Long March to Freedom is the name of the album. Berry Gordy and Motown put it out. So, the I have a dream part is spontaneous, at least in the Southern Baptist Black African American tradition, right? And that's what we tend to remember. And for me, that's the part where people who misuse the image of King kind of take bits and pieces from that part of the aspirational to say, see, Dr. King really wanted us to get along. I mean, it's an absolute travesty when people who are advocates of or anti-DEI or critical race theory or gerrymandering, and they actually use clips from this speech, from the I Have a Dream speech, to justify ideas and beliefs that Dr. King vehemently opposed. So it's almost like two speeches, Liz. It is the 100 years later, where are we? How far have we not come? The demand for justice in the civil rights movement being a nonviolent revolution that can make this nation fulfill its promises equally to all people. And that if we do, I have a dream that we will accomplish this. So, in a nutshell, to me, that's what makes the I Have a Dream speech so important. It is a reality check, it is a symbol of hope. And it's the if we fulfill the promises that the founders made to all citizens equally, this is what can result justice and harmony, not just one or the other.
It's so interesting because now I want to go back and listen to this because I do know at the end he does get very like he is a preacher at the end. And that's, I mean, I think that's what always like, you know, gives me the goosebumps. But I want to go back a little bit because the part where he says, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's interesting as we come up on this, 250th anniversary, but again, that this was the 100th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And the way he uses, like you said, the Bible, but then he's also using the Gettysburg Address. He just brings so many things into his speeches and to his writing that help connect people to what he's talking about.
Absolutely. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of Dr. King, and one of the reasons I say he's the finest citizen that this country produced in the 20th century, right? It's because he's never exclusionary. This is a vision of the nation. This is a vision of humanity that is inclusive. He's not leaving people out. As a matter of fact, in this speech, Liz, he tells Black people that all white people are not our enemy, basically. Look around. We have allies. This is not a Black movement. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that this speech was not universally accepted by all African Americans after it was given. He was criticized by people who said, you're too accommodationist. You are too gradualist, right? Even though he addressed, the poison of gradualism, the intoxicating nature of gradualism, I believe is what he called it in the speech. So it was not universally applauded in real time like it has become in historical memory. As a matter of
Mhm.
fact, one of the things that happened as a result of this speech, Liz, we think that all of these principles are universal, that all Americans will agree with it. No, the FBI said this man is dangerous and we need to increase our surveillance because of the impact he has as a public speaker. So, because of this speech, it didn't make all Americans love him or say, wow, what great ideas. Justice for all.
Mhm.
No, it actually revealed to some that he was either a sellout, that he wasn't radical enough, or that he was so dangerous that the FBI's COINTELPRO program actually increased their surveillance and kept closer monitoring on King because of the danger that he posed the status quo. And that's sobering.
Mhm. And it is worth remembering that he was an incredibly controversial figure. Like you said, people have this Disneyfication of him, but even his daughter, Dr. Bernice King, like on her Instagram will say, like, my father was controversial. You all seem to forget this and just take pieces of writing to fit whatever, narrative you want to have. So I'm glad that you're talking about, like, this is not something that, again, people are like, wow, this is great. Let's do this.
No, as a matter of fact, I think personally, one of the most important sermons that he ever gave was Beyond Vietnam. It's called the Riverside
Mhm.
Sermon, given exactly 1 year before his death in 1967, in which he said, because of the war in Vietnam, I have seen my dream turned into a nightmare. Okay. So, no, this is the I have a dream part is aspirational. It's almost a utopia. For if
Mhm.
we do what we promise our citizens we will do, this is where we'll get. But things get so bad in the civil rights struggles, even after. As a matter of fact, I think after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which, we can't forget the fact that this actually did inspire and encourage JFK to say,
Mhm.
okay, this is in the vein of what it means to be an American. It is not threatening, right? That there is widespread support. It actually enabled him,
Mhm.
encouraged him, I should say, to follow through on his promises. So it worked. But in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act and the next year, the Voting Rights Act, which are passed by or signed into law by President Johnson, this is where Dr. King understood that the easy part is over. Laws have been changed. But now, what about this island of poverty
Mhm.
on which Black people live? And the fact that Black people remained, even after the passage of these laws, a vast exile in his own land, right? So the problems that King addressed were only magnified after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And when you know that part of the history, there's no way that you can co-opt King to support measures and political legislation that are the actual antithesis of what he addressed in the I Have a Dream speech.
So this is why, you and I are, it's 2026. We're talking about this speech as we come up on 250 years of our country. Why is it, how could you argue, maybe I should ask, that it is more important now than ever to know pieces of history like this and to read these words and have an understanding in 2026? We are two white people
Absolutely.
discussing Dr. King.
That's right.
Why is this important?
We are two Americans who happen to be white,
Mhm.
talking about the importance of these values for what we claim we are as Americans. It's important because, from my perspective, Liz, looking back at 250 years, we have people who are misusing history to validate some of the most un-American policies and stances in ways that are dishonest and disingenuous. So when we know the context, when we know the history, when we know what the founders intended, what they didn't intend, how Reconstruction, emancipation changes the meaning of the Constitution, how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are as important as they were then and they are now, when we understand that people who saw the best of what America could be, but wasn't yet, speak truth to power in a nonviolent yet threatening way, I think that it's important to us that we continue that work and become inheritors of that promise and continue to stress justice over harmony and use historical reality as the evidence we need to demand those reforms. That's why it's important. You're going to have people now celebrating the 250th who misrepresent our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the founders, for very disingenuous ways. You know, we see it. If this history wasn't so important, there wouldn't be so many efforts to try to whitewash it. If the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act weren't revolutionary in their political outcomes, we wouldn't have so many people trying to roll back those gains. So we have to be educated. We have to be knowledgeable about the context. We have to understand the consequences of these events. And we have to demand our right to teach them honestly so that we can fulfill the promise of what Dr. King spoke of on August 28, 1963.
Dr. Butler, I feel like that is the perfect end cap to this. And again, listeners, if you haven't listened to Letter from a Birmingham Jail, I think, like you said, this is a perfect pairing of it. Dr. Butler, I just genuinely have so much gratitude for your expertise, again, for your friendship with the pod, with me, and with history teachers around the nation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the platform. Hey, this is what it's all about. It does us as professional academics no good kind of being sequestered in our ivory tower and writing and thinking these big thoughts when there is a fight on the ground, and we need to make sure that we can use our expertise to support the people who are on the front lines every day. So I appreciate it, Liz.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.